6 things poor families owned that actually saved them during the Great Depression. What if I told you that the most powerful survival tools during the worst economic collapse in American history weren't money, weren't gold, and weren't government handouts? What if the very things that saved millions of desperate families were sitting in their kitchens, barns, and sewing rooms all along? The Great Depression began on October 29th, 1929, a date that would haunt America for over a decade. By 1933, 1 in 4 Americans had lost their jobs completely. Families who once lived comfortable, middle-class lives were suddenly lining up at soup kitchens and begging for bread. The national suicide rate reached an all-time high that same year. Men shattered by shame, unable to feed their own children. But here's what history books rarely tell you. Some families didn't just survive the Depression. They endured it with a quiet shock and dignity, not because they had money, but because of what they already owned. If you find this story fascinating and want more jaw-dropping history and finance content, please subscribe to our channel right now. We post stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what's coming next. 1. The backyard garden patch. It sounds almost insultingly simple, doesn't it? A patch of dirt behind the house, some seeds, a few rows of vegetables, and yet this humble thing became the single greatest weapon against starvation in the 1930s. Growing your own vegetables was considered both necessary and wise. Plowing up the sunniest portion of the yard became common. Physical work was honorable, and a beautiful home garden was something to be proud of. Many American families during the Depression literally survived because they had enough soil to grow food. In Texas, one great-grandmother grew corn, beets, peas, tomatoes, watermelon, cantaloupe, carrots, onions, yellow squash, cucumbers, green beans, okra, lettuce, spinach, and herbs in their 5,100-foot fenced garden. She fed her entire family from that earth. Farmers could produce much of their own food, while city residents could not. Almost all farm families raised large gardens with vegetables and canned fruit from their orchards. That single difference, a garden versus no garden, could mean the difference between life and death. Urban families without gardens suffered tremendously. Town families could not produce their own food. Many city dwellers often went hungry. Think about that for a moment. 2 families, same city, same broken economy, but one had a garden and survived. The other went hungry every single night. Many families of the 1930s say their gardens got them through the Depression. Gardens were tended on farms, in suburban backyards, and in vacant lots and parks in the cities. People were tearing up flower beds, ripping out grass, and planting food in every square inch of available land. Whether they stayed in town or moved to the country, families began to cut their expenses as much as possible. Practical and old-fashioned ways of doing things became desirable. One account from the period says families purchased only flour, sugar, salt, coffee, baking soda, and baking powder from stores. Everything else came from the ground they tended with their own tired hands. The garden didn't just feed bodies, it fed hope. When a child could walk outside and pull a ripe tomato from the vine, it meant there was still something to eat tomorrow. 2 glass canning jars. Here is something that would genuinely shock you. Simple glass jar, the kind your grandmother kept on dusty pantry shelves, was arguably the most important piece of technology a poor family could own during the Great Depression. Home canning became a means of survival for many Depression-era families. Without refrigerators, without money to buy food in winter, without any safety net at all, families turned to their canning jars and preserved everything they grew. Fresh fruits and vegetables, canned in the summer and fall, provided enough wholesome food to last until a new garden was planted the following spring. That is the whole survival formula right there. Grow in summer, can in fall, eat through the deadly winter. Green beans and cut corn were the most frequently canned vegetables. Thrifty 1930s homemakers also canned dandelion leaves, radish leaves, Swiss chard, spinach, and collard greens. Women were canning things that today we would throw in the compost bin without a second thought. One first-hand account from the era describes a woman named Mildred who recalled staring at rows of yellow corn and red tomatoes in glass jars in the fruit cellar and feeling something close to joy. Those jars meant her children would eat. Their use expanded during World War I and the Great Depression as families grew war gardens and worked to feed themselves through the 1930s. The practice was so widespread and so critical that community canneries opened in schools and on university grounds just to help families preserve more food faster. People reused canning jars over and over again for storing not only food, but also household items like screws, nails, and even small tools. The jars were used and reused until they cracked or chipped. Nothing was ever wasted. Nothing was ever thrown away. One woman described her mother's rule: no more than 4 hours from garden to jar. That was the discipline of survival. And that glass jar, sitting quietly on a wooden shelf, held the difference between feeding your children or watching them cry from hunger in the dark. 3. Flour sacks and feed bags. This is the one that will truly astonish you because it involves one of the most creative acts of survival in American history. When the economy collapsed and the fashion industry fell apart, clothing consumption dropped from $11.20 billion in 1929 to just $5.4 billion in 1933. Poor families found an answer in the most unlikely place. The cotton bags that held their flour and animal feed, and fabrics and cash were scarce. Rural housewives turned to feed sacks, often made from rough cotton fabric, to make towels, curtains, underwear, and sometimes even dresses. Think about that. Women were sewing dresses from the same bags that held chicken feed and baking flour. For many families, disposable income was scarce, and the durable fabric from food sacks offered a rare opportunity for new clothing. To hide any sign of poverty, home sewers soaked off labels, dyed the fabric, and added embellishments. These women were quietly brilliant. They were determined that their children would not walk to school in rags. The acute lack of money meant that many already poor families literally had very little to wear. There are numerous contemporary photographs of women and children dressed in sacks and very little else. The shocking part of this story is what happened next. Flour and feed companies noticed what was happening. By 1925, Gingham Girl Flour offered bags in a variety of colors with labels that were easy to wash off, and the Textile Bag Manufacturers Association published a how-to book on sewing dresses from flour sacks. Companies began competing over women's tastes, hiring designers, printing colorful floral patterns, and even including little patterns for doll clothes on the bags. The National Museum of American History noted that with feed sacks and flour bags, farm women took thriftiness to new heights of creativity, transforming the humble bags into dresses, underwear, towels, curtains, quilts, and other household necessities. Boys wore flour sack shirts to school. Girls wore flour sack dresses to church. Mothers stitched flour sack curtains onto bare windows, and not one of them let shame stop them because their neighbors were doing the exact same thing. As the 1930s progressed, its wide utilization of feed sacks was no longer considered an embarrassing mark of poverty, but a sign of resourcefulness during a time of hardship. The Smithsonian Museum of Natural History today holds a second-place dress from 1959 made entirely from flour sacks. It is beautiful. For chickens, this is the one that surprises people the most. Not cattle, not hogs, chickens. The scrappy, noisy, inexpensive, glorious chicken was one of the greatest financial survival tools a Depression-era family could possess. Chickens are compact and easy to keep, which made them a very important source of protein for both rural landowners and those who lived closer into town on smaller lots. Here's why chickens were so astonishing in their usefulness. They fed themselves. When turned out into a fenced yard or pasture area, chickens set right to work, scratching, pecking, and hunting for the bugs, spiders, seeds, and tender green weeds they loved to eat. For this reason, they were an asset to every family during the Great Depression because they had almost zero feed cost. Zero feed cost. In a decade when every single cent mattered, eggs provided an important source of protein for Depression families and were an important item when making do. Even when the weather became too hot for crops, the hens continued to scratch for seed and bugs, and they kept laying eggs. Chickens kept laying even when crops failed, even when the drought came, even when the dust storms turned the sky black. Chickens definitely helped families remain properly nourished and able to barter pay some of their expenses. Doctors were often paid in food, preserves, livestock, or produce. A family with chickens had protein every morning in the form of eggs. They had the possibility of meat when times were slightly better. And they had something to trade with neighbors, with doctors, with anyone who needed food more than they needed cash. People who owned chickens kept them alive for their eggs. Chicken substitutes actual chicken with egg, combined with boiled and peeled tomato, onion, and butter. Families were so aware of the chicken's value that they invented recipes called mock chicken dishes, made to taste like chicken using only eggs, because slaughtering a hen meant losing future eggs forever. The chicken was too valuable to eat carelessly. It was a living savings account, producing daily dividends in the form of eggs. 5. Cast iron cookware. Walk into a modern kitchen and you will find non-stick pans, electric appliances, and devices that cost hundreds of dollars. In the 1930s, the most important cooking tool in a poor family's home was a heavy, black, virtually indestructible cast iron skillet or a Dutch oven. And it saved families in ways that go far beyond just cooking food. Cast iron cookware required no electricity. Those who could not afford a refrigerator and those who lived in rural areas without electricity had ice boxes to keep food fresh. When electricity was cut off, and it was cut off for millions of families, cast iron still worked perfectly over a wood fire, a coal stove, or an open flame outside. Families cooked everything in cast iron. Beans simmered for hours in cast iron Dutch ovens, stretching small amounts of food into filling meals. Beans, navy, pinto, white, black-eyed, were a good substitute for meat during the Depression and were even an actual lifesaver in the 1930s. Highly nutritious. Beans of all varieties were baked, used as fillers for sandwiches, made into bean cakes, and included as chief ingredients in hearty soups. Soup, the ultimate Depression survival food, was made in cast iron pots that were never washed with soap to preserve the seasoning layer built up over decades. Big families could be fed with soups from leftover meats, beans, and homegrown vegetables. For some families, soup was the evening meal every night. Cast iron skillet outlasted the Depression itself. It was passed from mother to daughter, generation to generation, already seasoned with decades of survival cooking. A family with cast iron could cook on any heat source in any condition with almost any ingredient they managed to scrape together that day. The skillet didn't care if you were poor. It just cooked whatever you put in it. And in a decade of absolute chaos, that reliability was worth more than almost anything money could buy. 6. The radio. Of all 6 items on this list, this one might be the most unexpected. A radio. Not as a luxury, not as entertainment, exactly, but as a survival tool in the most profound psychological sense. By the early 1930s, many middle-class families owned a home radio. Comedy programs, soap operas, sporting events, and swing music distracted listeners from everyday struggles. But this was far more than distraction. The national suicide rate rose to an all-time high in 1933. The stress of financial strain took a psychological toll, especially on men who were suddenly unable to provide for their families. The mental devastation of the Great Depression was real, and it was deadly. Families that collapsed emotionally could not plant gardens, could not preserve food, could not hold together. The radio was the thread that connected isolated, desperate families to a world beyond their suffering. It brought them the voice of President Franklin D. Roosevelt through his famous fireside chats broadcasts that told millions of terrified Americans that someone in power saw them, heard them, and was fighting for them. The radio brought news, laughter, music, and a sense of shared national experience. A family with little food would stay in bed to save fuel and avoid burning calories. Imagine lying in that bed, cold and hungry, and hearing a voice on the radio remind you that you were not alone. That was the radio's true power. It kept people mentally alive when their physical circumstances were trying to kill them. And families who stayed psychologically connected, who kept their marriages together, who kept their hope intact, were the ones who survived long enough to watch the economy recover. The radio cost almost nothing to operate once you owned it. And what it returned was incalculable. It saved sanity when sanity was the last thing standing between a family and complete collapse. The shocking truth here is what ties all 6 of these things together, and why this story matters so deeply today. None of these survival tools were purchased during the crisis. The garden was already there. Canning jars were already on the shelves. The chickens were already in the yard. The flour sacks came with the flour. Cast iron skillet was already on the stove. The radio was already in the corner of the living room. The families who survived the Great Depression did so because of choices and habits built long before the catastrophe hit. The average American family lived by the Depression-era motto, use it up, wear it out, make do, or do without. That motto was not adopted in crisis. It was already a way of life for families who had always understood that tomorrow was never guaranteed. Most American families during the 1930s felt the economic pinch as the U.S. plummeted into the difficult decade named the Great Depression. However, families pulled together and weathered the difficult decade with a lot of strength and integrity. By the end of 1932, the Depression had crushed 60 million people. But those who had a garden, some jars, a few chickens, a cast iron pot, flour sacks, and a radio, they made it. Not comfortably, not easily, but they made it. And that is perhaps the most important financial lesson any of us can take from the darkest decade in American economic history. Preparation is not paranoia. Simplicity is not poverty. Resourcefulness is not weakness. The things that save you in a crisis are rarely the things you buy when the crisis arrives. They are the things you quietly, wisely built into your life long before anyone saw the storm coming. What do you think? Could your family survive today with these same 6 things? Which of these surprises you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And if this story moved you, shocked you, or taught you something new, please subscribe to our channel right now. We bring you real history, real money lessons, and real stories of human survival every single week. Hit that subscribe button and join our community. We'll see you in the next one.